Welcome everyone to a new month of videos. And as some of you may know, I'm trying to pick a theme for each month and then create content both on YouTube and Instagram and also in my physical classes in studio and one-to-one classes as well. This month, what I'd like to focus on is the theme of what is known in Sanskrit as tapas. And tapas as a word or as a concept, you can find it in the Yoga Sutras. And where I'd like to start by explaining what tapas is, and we'll unpack this over the weeks ahead, is that we can think of tapas in this way. Day to day, our conditioned mind and our patterning draws us into connection with and into attachment of various ways of thinking and various forms of doing. So what does that mean? It means that basically each day we pretty much slip into a automated pilot mode where we go about doing the things that we've always done, generally speaking. So it might be going to work, it might be thinking in a certain way, it might be eating at a certain time, it might be watching certain things at certain times of day. It might be communicating with our friends and our family. It might be going out in the evening or going out for a meal or whatever it might be. All of the habits and patterns in our lives are things that tend to play out each day. And each time we do them, we galvanize or strengthen the nature of that pattern. So the more that we do something, the more that we are likely to do it in the future, unless we take some kind of action to guide us in a different direction. Now, what that means is that when we come to something like yoga, or a practice that is designed over time as a pathway to bring us towards a place of peace, or to know a place of peace within us, and to gradually spend more and more time developing or cultivating that connection. At first, the idea of yoga may sound great, but what we find is that when we need to practice, when we need to step onto the mat, when we want to maybe take a few minutes out of the day to do some quiet breathing or meditation or reflection, the weight and power of all of those previous habits and patterns suddenly begins to become very, very apparent. Because what I notice in teaching, and what I notice in particular with working one-to-one with people, is that one of the biggest challenges to practicing on our own, for example, is the fact that there are so many other distractions around us and things that we could be doing that in some way kind of feel more easy, even though we know that those things may not actually be bringing us towards peace. So for example, it's much easier in a way to turn on Netflix and watch a movie or watch a comedy show or a documentary than it might be to force ourselves, for want of a better word, to sit on the mat and to meditate or to breathe. It's much easier to maybe go to the freezer and get some ice cream or something sweet to eat rather than to reflect on the day we've had in a meditative or in a yogic manner. Similarly, it's easier maybe to get on the phone to a friend or to a family member than to do some practice. So these are the patterns that are incredibly strong and forceful in our minds, that have the potential to stop us from practicing, or even if we do practice over time, they have the potential to draw us away from that practice. So in that sense, one of the ways that we can see tapas as a concept is simply by thinking that tapas is the energy or the effort, or some might say the discipline required to overcome the previous patterning and conditions of our mind, in order that we can practice something that over the long term is beneficial for us in terms of bringing ourselves to peace. And it's fair to say that this discipline or this effort is absolutely necessary, not just at the beginning of our practice, because, for example, when we start to practice, we might actually have more enthusiasm for practice because it's something that feels new and we feel that we're giving ourselves something beneficial. But also after we've been practicing a while, when perhaps we start to take for granted our practice, and maybe we might start to enter into a mindset that says, well, maybe I actually don't need to practice anymore. So tapas as a discipline or as an effort to overcome the things that we would normally be doing in order to create a new pattern that moves us towards peace is an absolutely essential ingredient in any long-term yogic practice. And it's something that you can reflect on in your own lives. And when I'm talking about practice, by the way, I'm not necessarily talking about doing an hour-long practice or a half an hour practice. This is something that I hope slowly starts to come across as you watch these videos. Even 5 minutes of practice of just sitting calmly, of breathing, of practicing mindfulness, of meditating on some beneficial object, whatever it might be, can be absolutely of value, as much value perhaps in some cases as a long practice. But the challenge is that in the middle of the day, when the emails are buzzing and the phone is going and we have all the pressures of all of the things that we need to do, and we are so habituated towards doing those things rather than doing anything else, it is so easy for our practice of even just sitting still and taking 12 slow, calm, soothing breaths. It's so easy for that stuff to be dropped or to fall by the wayside because of the heavy conditioning of the mind that just says, this is what we do. This is how we're going to get through the day. So don't mind that other stuff. Don't worry about doing the breathing. How good or how beneficial can that actually be? So actually, in a way, part of this tapas practice, if you like, is actually beginning to recognize and become aware of the fact that there are these latent patterns, which are known as samskaras in Sanskrit terminology, that are absolutely present for each and every one of us. And because most of the time we've never seriously undertaken any practice to start observing those patterns or to unpicking those patterns so that we might move our lives into a more peaceful and calm space, most of us are not even aware of those patterns. So almost the first step with tapas is to recognize the power of those patterns and how those patterns and what we might call habituated tendencies draw us away from sitting on the mat, draw us away from maybe lying in shavasana for 5 or 10 minutes, draw us away from all of these things that ultimately we have a sense that they are going to be beneficial. But because we haven't done them much, the weight or their own power is nothing in relation to the power of all of the patterns that we have already built up. So therefore, in summary, this introduction to tapas can be seen as follows. We all know that in order to get the benefit from our practice, we need to try and practice on a regular basis. We all know that something like perhaps 12 breaths a few times a day can be beneficial for us, but whether we do it or not is a completely different part of the equation. So what I would like to request, what I would like to invite you to do is that in the coming weeks, see if you can create some time to do some breathing practices, to do some meditation, to do some asana, and just notice what happens in your mind when you actually plan to do that practice, and notice whether you actually end up doing that practice, and notice if you don't end up doing that practice. If you do that practice, notice what kind of mental walkthrough you have to do to get yourself into the practice. And if you don't do the practice, without judgment, just notice what happened and notice what you ended up doing instead of that. One of the most powerful things that yoga teaches us is that if we continue to do the same things time and time again, we will get the same result. In other words, if we live in a stressed and anxious state and we continue to maintain the same patterns and the same behaviors, we will continue to live and reside in that space. Yoga teaches us that just by taking small steps in a different direction, a breath here, a breath there, a moment of mindfulness here, a moment of mindfulness there, we can start to change the power of those patterns and create new patterns that take us in a new direction. And the effort of overcoming the discomfort that stops us from undertaking these practices can be known or called tapas. So we'll continue with this theme over the course of the month. I hope you will join me. As always, I hope that you found this video useful, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon. Thank you. Namaste.